I should just yell, wake up, since we just ate lunch. I made the bad, terrible food choices, though. Knowing I had to speak, I just kept choosing all the delicious meats and things like that. And it could get messy up here. No, hopefully not. First, just thank you to Hammond, to Francisca, to Mitch, to everyone who put this gathering together. It really is an honor to have a chance to just share and thereby workshop some of my current research with all of you. Just hearing your responses, or your questions rather, from my questions yesterday, I promise the goal is not to try to legitimize my own research by asking you those questions. But I think what it did was actually raise the necessity of looking back at this era, turn of the 20th century, that becomes foundational to defining what is the modern world, and to think about, okay, how do Indigenous peoples contribute to modernity? And not only how do they contribute, but how do they also preserve their own self-governing, self-declaring identities, spaces, nations, etc. So I'm really honored to be able to have this opportunity to share work with you. What I'm sharing today is actually part of a longer paper that a revision of which is due end of next week. I've been holding off. It's forthcoming in the 20th anniversary special volume of Atlantic Studies. It's supposed to be talking about the futurity of Atlantic studies. But I didn't want to revise until I got to hear what you all were thinking. So I have a lot of work to do after your comments and questions today. Not to say I haven't been revising along the way, but I didn't want to finalize anything. So I've kind of curated parts to give you a highlight of 3 different Indigenous travelers across from 1850 until the 1920s. So just 3 little samples to give us a sense of what's going on. And I want to start with a poem. This is by E. Pauline Johnson. She's a Canadian Mohawk poet, the turn of the 20th century. She actually didn't come down into Austria and Germany, but traveled to England a number of times. And this is a love poem written to her then partner from Heidelberg. And so this is just a quick snippet of it. But she writes, "Did fate decree your art and mine should weave into a future Spain, when you were born in Heidelberg and I was born in Vain?" And I use this up front as a way of framing an Indigenous response to Western modernity, and what place Indigenous peoples have within that modernity. What might European or transatlantic Indigenous relationships actually look like? So part of this larger project, what I'm trying to figure out is how we might broaden the archives we engage to historicize Indigenous experiences at the turn of the 20th century, so that we can move away from this traditional versus modernist binary and get to more closely to a reality of an either or a both and identity rather than either or, where traditionalism and modernism become collaborative rather than exclusive from one another. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of the works written by, published by, and also received by Indigenous peoples demonstrates, is the ability to actually thrive in a modernist space and through modernist aesthetics that they've self-determined, rather than just either assimilating or disappearing. So, let's start with some terribleness. I don't know if you can see this. I have no critique on Karl May or whatever. We're not doing that today. That's for another day. But each summer, the historic town in northern Germany of Bad Segeberg has a resident population of about 20,000 people. They welcome the world. They claim to have about 250,000 visitors each year to the Karl May Spiele. It's at the Kalkberg Stadion, which is originally one of the Tingstätte of Nazi Germany. It was then transformed into this public outdoor amphitheater. And this transition is actually part of a really fascinating history in Germany and Austria. Some of you brought it up in your conversations yesterday, of a phenomenon that a scholar named Hartmut Lutz describes as indie enthusiasm. or a specifically German fascination with indigenous peoples in this very romanticized, want to adopt these connections to nature, etc., type of noble savage identities. Because of this, what really has been since the mid 1800s, even before though, this long fascination with indigenous peoples, it's lended itself to a very dominated discourse around indigenous experiences in German-speaking Europe, to be what the relationships initiated by German travelers, German missionaries, people like Karl May, who didn't travel at all but just had this fantastic imagination about the Wild West. And in so doing, it's pushed aside the actual experiences of indigenous people in German-speaking European spaces. Hartmut Lutz has done some really interesting work just recently. This actually came out in 2020, where he and two other scholars, one indigenous, one settler scholar from Canada, came together and interviewed about 14 indigenous artists, scholars, public intellectuals, etc., who regularly traveled to Germany, Austria, and Switzerland to see what their experience has been like. And I want to highlight just one of them. This is Jeanette Armstrong. She's an Okanagan scholar and writer from southeastern British Columbia. But she talks about how in German-speaking spaces in Europe, she's been able to experience a very different transatlantic relationship than in other European spaces. And you can see here, I'll just pull out a couple of phrases though. She describes it as being possible because these relationships aren't governed by what she describes as the sort of hidden deep prejudices that come from a centuries-long and ongoing strategy of colonizing indigenous peoples and being always, even if subconsciously, what she describes as being on the defensive about it. So my work is not trying to render in the enthusiasm, much like these indigenous scholars and artists interviews are not trying to render this German fascination with indigenous peoples as non-problematic or as somehow innocent, but rather to think about how indigenous travelers today and all the way back, actually as early as the 1700s, are some of the earliest indigenous travelers to German-speaking Europe, how they recognize a space that didn't have the land holdings, the theocratic authority, etc., over North American indigeneity. So they recognize a space that through centuries of deep fascination in indigenous peoples might actually be a fruitful space for discourse or for intercultural exchange. So turning back to E. Pauline Johnson's 1900 poem, I'm interested in how present-day and early indigenous travelers have engaged German-speaking Europe, both the spaces themselves and their imagination, for the collaborative potential of future fostering interweaving of art and ideas. As E. Pauline Johnson writes, your art and mine should weave into a future Spain. Between the globally recognized high civilization of modern Europe and the still so often sidelined epistemologies of Turtle Island or North America. So what I'm trying to do with these earlier travelers is to broaden the epistemological, the methodological, and even the literary genealogies of this transatlantic indigenous travel. And so to do that, we'll turn just to a couple, actually a few. 3 is a few, right? Okay, so this one here is Anishinaabe writer Gagagagaba, or George Copway. And the second is most commonly known as Black Elk, or Hehaka Sapa. And the third is a hereditary Haudenosaunee chief and appointed delegate named Deskahe, or Levi General. These 3 offer a representative sample of how developing transatlantic and even global relations extended beyond just direct colonial powers like Spain, France, and England, and informed the literacies and the self-determining practices of indigenous modernity back at home. I'm interested in the ways that these 3, as a sample of hundreds of transatlantic indigenous travelers, were able to think through how do indigenous peoples participate in a modernity where at home that modernity looks like forced assimilation in boarding schools, it looks like termination of tribal status, it looks like relocation, it looks like reservation spaces. This is what's happening at home in the US and in Canada. And so how are they going to engage in global modernity when at home everything that distinguishes them as indigenous peoples is being erased? So the United States is moving away from settler colonial violence to strategies that ultimately have the same end in mind, which is to exterminate indigenous title to North American spaces. So let's turn to the first one, George Copway. Oh, sorry, that is not George Copway, but you'll soon know. You'll soon see. In 1850, he was invited by a U.S. peace activist to go as the sole Native American representative, and actually what they called the delegate of the so-called Christian Native Americans or Christian Indians of America. He was supposed to go and present at the World Peace Congress in Frankfurt, which many scholars have argued set the stage for the later League of Nations. So he, as the only indigenous delegate of the more than 400 global delegates, went to present in Frankfurt in front of several thousand spectators who listened to these prepared lectures or to listen to these delegates debate what would be necessary to create what they call the universal fraternity, or to end war. That was the goal of the Global Peace Congress, right? Copway actually arrived with letters of invitation from people like Henry Schoolcraft, James Fenimore Cooper of Last Mohicans fame, some of the most prominent literary and ethnographic figures in the United States at the time are introducing him to Europe. So he comes with these letters of introduction, and as such, he actually gets invited to give a distinguished lecture at the Congress. But before he gets to speak, this dude, Richard Cobden, who was at the time a free trade advocate from the British Parliament. And he's giving a speech about the need to disband permanent armaments in European spaces. And he turns to Copway and introduces him as kind of the stand-in for the successful Christianization of indigenous peoples in North America, and also of what it looks like to be a moral modern person. So I'll actually read it in full. Sorry, the lighting's kind of strange up here, but why we are worse than the Red Indians. I see before me, pointing to Copway, a gentleman representing the Indian tribes of America. You will have the opportunity of listening to by and by and of learning from his talents and accomplishments how capable that interesting but injured race is of taking part in intelligent movements of civilized men. It will inspire you with hope for the future of the Aborigines of America and fill you with sentiments of shame for the wrongs inflicted upon that people. I say then, so far as these permanent standing armaments are concerned, we present ourselves before the world as greater savages than even the North American Indian tribes. So with Cobden's selective, possessive, collective hour, or selective use of that possessive hour, he simultaneously introduces Copway as being one who's taking part in the so-called civilized or intelligent movements of civilized men, but also is excluding him from having membership in any sovereign nation. He distinguishes, or he establishes him before he even has the opportunity to speak to the Congress as a so-called ahistorical other against which various narratives of modernity could be written. Or to use Cherokee scholar Daniel Heath Justice's words, in relation to a broader discourse of Western modernity, Cobden uses even what seems to be sincere praise of the so-called accomplishments, etc., the self-justifying rhetoric of European civilization over indigenous savagery that is core to the subsequent policies and practices of assimilation, displacement, and replacement that undergird the ongoing actions of settler colonialism. Curiously, although Copway dedicates 3 chapters of his later published travelogue of all this time in Europe, he publishes it the year after he returns to the US. He actually publishes 3 full books in that one year, which is pretty good for any writer. but especially for an Indigenous writer at that time. He writes very little about his own speech in Congress. He describes a lot about what other people are saying, and he gives this note about his own speech. I have made my poorest speech. The only part that he includes beyond this statement is his proposal of the Congress's fifth resolution, which states, this Congress, acknowledging the principle of non-intervention, recognizes it to be the sole right of every state to regulate its own affairs. His other books that he publishes that same year are all about Ojibwe or Anishinaabe nationhood, which I think is really interesting, connected to this statement that he was supposed to present to the Congress. His simultaneous self-critique and assertion of self-determination demonstrates what I think is his acute awareness of the states and claims of modern discourse, but also of the weight of self and collective or communal Indigenous representation on a global stage. Some American and British reactions to his speech criticized Copway for going over time. They were only supposed to speak for 20 minutes. Apparently he spoke for about 40 minutes. And also for what they saw as his, quote, stunted confidence. But the local German press, again, conditioned by a lot of indie enthusiasm leading up to this, celebrated his speech. And Copway actually wrote in his own travelogue, in the course of 2 hours after, my speech was already in the language of the Germans. Rather than lamenting his speaking beyond the allotted time or sensing a diminished sense of confidence, the German press emphasizes his ability to move from his ostensibly primitive, albeit romanticized upbringing into the most prestigious circles of Western modern thought. So they kind of carry on or perpetuate that idea that Cobden had already presented in the beginning. In fact, the fullest version of Copway's speech to Congress actually exists in the German minutes of the meeting and is excluded from the English minutes of the meeting. And by the time we get to the third person we'll be talking about, you'll see why that's significant in this exclusion of Indigenous declarations of self-governance or of nationhood. The rhetorical context, I'll actually jump ahead so you can read it as I go. The rhetorical context that does not carry through the English reports is Copway's repeated motif of die Kette der Verbrüderung that will reach from Nation to Nation, from Insel to Insel, from Weltteil to Weltteil. It is this chain of brotherhood, he states, that will transform men of war into workers of peace, arts, literature, science, craft, and industry. Some literary scholars, when they turn to his travelogue, they talk about how his shifting tone and collage style compilation. So what he does is actually, every city he visits, he gives kind of a history of that city, all the main figures, the main spaces, and then he describes his own kind of interactions with those spaces or with people in those areas. But they describe this collage style narrative as something that Kate Flint, a literary scholar who writes quite a bit about Copway, as an inner dichotomy. This experience of double consciousness, right? As he sought to negotiate the contradictory demands of Western modernity. However, Copway in his own piece, he's actually writing about, he's out drinking with some German poets. He claims he wasn't drinking, but the German poets in their own sources claim he was drinking. Anyway, they're having this fun night out. He's also with some graduate students that are there who have come to listen to him speak. And then he just kind of disappears. And so they go out to find him. But I think it's actually a really interesting commentary on how this idea of double consciousness may itself be a Western construct. Because he writes, they thought, I suppose, that an Indian could not find his way home. This idea that being in a modern space like Frankfurt, like London, like all these European cities, that he would somehow be lost. So they went out looking for him, found him at home. And so this idea that his experience was this victim of double consciousness, of self-contradicting identities, I think he's pointing to the idea that it may be itself a Western construct that we place upon people of color who are interacting in dominantly white spaces. So let's jump from Copway over to Black Elk, or Hehaka Sapa. He traveled to Europe not as someone invited by all the literary elites of the time, but actually as a performer on Buffalo Bill's very widely popular Wild West shows, which some of you talked about, the Human Zoos. a number of those performances were part of those same circuits or networks of performativity. In his life sketch, or his autobiographical writings, they're actually all done orally and then transcribed by a non-Indigenous scholar, but he reflects very little about his experiences abroad, and instead he focuses a lot on the way that Western and Oglala Lakota, which is his home community, how Western European and Oglala modernities are irreconcilable. And he gives this as a beginning example. He writes, "I can remember when the bison were so many that they could not be counted, but more and more Wasichus, or whites, came to kill them until there were only heaps of bones scattered where they used to be. The Wasichus did not kill them to eat, they killed them for the metal that makes them crazy. You see that the men who did this were crazy. They just killed and killed because they liked to do that. When we hunted bison, we killed only what we needed." Here, Black Elk describes the westward expansion of Euro-American modernity as crazed with profit and violent power. Lakota modernity at home, on the other hand, which he goes on to describe here in a second, continued a long-standing practice of environmental stewardship and of communal reciprocity, this practice of taking care of one another. He describes the Wasichus did not care for each other the way our people did before the nation's hoop was broken. They had forgotten that the earth was their mother. So from the outset, he frames Western modernity as parasitic, as this coming in and exploiting everything to claim economic and political power. What's interesting is rather than dedicating a chunk of his time, he spent a number of years in Europe on this performing circuit. The main thing he writes about, or he shares with his transcriber, is a spiritual vision that he receives when he falls ill while he's here in Europe. And he describes what he sees in this vision. He says, "I saw the Missouri River. Then I saw far off the Black Hills in the center of the world where the spirits had taken me in my great vision. Then I was right over Pine Ridge. I looked down and could not understand what I saw because it seemed that nearly all of my people of the different bands were together there in a big camp. I saw my father's and mother's teepee. They were outside and she was cooking. I wanted to jump off of the cloud and be with them." In 1889, which is the same year he received the vision before he ever went back home again, the U.S. Federal Indian Bureau had actually organized Pine Ridge, his home community, into the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, which placed the 7 bands of the Oglala, who were then all distinct, into a designated federally surveilled place. I bring his story of irreconcilable modernities into this discussion of indigeneity, or transatlantic indigeneity, because how the European public simultaneously claimed his story and even his body as their own. Black Elk first appeared in the German-speaking press as early as 1898 as one of Buffalo Bill's performers in Vienna, where the Wiener Allgemeine Zeitung describes him as ein hübscher Bursche, wohlgebaut mit männlich kühnen Bögen und strahlenden dunklen Augen, or a handsome fellow well built with bold masculine strides and radiant dark eyes. These are everywhere in the German press at that time period, especially about him. They go on in the same article to claim that he intends to stay in Vienna. He says he's going to take up einen bürgerlichen Beruf. Black Elk ist nämlich wandermüde. I don't go into it in this piece because I don't have time. But later on, in the 1920s, newspapers actually claimed that he had returned to Europe and with a new performing group, and that he had died in Munich and is buried in the Munich cemetery, which never happened. He returned after his first tour with the Wild West, or with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, back to his Pine Ridge community, where he became a well-renowned traditional healer and medicine man, and died there and was buried in Pine Ridge. So according to the German language press, Black Elk belonged to European modernity because he was beautiful, because he performed well, and because he was civilly adaptable. He's willing to take on a bürgerlichen Beruf. Some even claim that he spoke German, but he didn't even speak or read English at the time he went to Europe. While Kopwe or Gagagagabau claimed indigenous discursive space and self-determination in Frankfurt, the German language press claimed Black Elk. They claimed his indigeneity for themselves. This juxtaposition of claiming and reclaiming indigenous bodies and the land-based epistemologies, rights, and titles that they hold is at the center of conflicting and overlapping modernities, this confluence of transatlantic bodies and nations. And with that, we'll jump to our final example. This is Descahe, or Levi General. So whereas Kopwe came as an invited delegate to the World Peace Congress, really by the modern and political elite of the time, while Black Elk came as an invitee or really as an employee of the Wild West show, Descahe actually traveled in 1923 as an official chief and delegate of the Haudenosaunee Nation. He actually even traveled on a Haudenosaunee passport. Haudenosaunee is actually the name of the Iroquois Confederacy, better known as the Iroquois Confederacy. It's the Haudenosaunee Confederacy or Nation. He traveled in 1923 to present the rights and realities of the Haudenosaunee Nation to the League of Nations. What was going on at the time in Canada and the United States is trying to push federally appointed or federally approved government structures onto Indigenous nations to sidestep Indigenous, traditional Indigenous self-governance or forms of self-governance to put in federally appointed or federally approved constitutional governments. The irony of that, of course, is that the Haudenosaunee had been practicing self-governance in a constitutional way dating all the way back to the Haudenosaunee Great Law, which predates the U.S. Constitution and the Magna Carta by about 1,000 years. His travels then were a direct petition to the League of Nations for recognition of the legitimacy of the Haudenosaunee nationhood. Some scholars have described his attempt in Switzerland as trying to reconcile this divide that was tearing apart Indigenous nations between the modernists and the traditionalists. Those who opposed hereditary chiefships or chief-based, hereditary-based governing structures, and those who wanted to adopt Euro-Western constitutional parliamentary type of governing structures. As Kopwe, Black Elk, and Descahe demonstrate, however, while Western modernity has sought to dichotomize Indigenous identities and communities by pitting the modernists, so-called modernists, against the so-called traditionalists, Indigenous individuals and communities, those actually living and engaging in the discursive and socio-political spaces of modernity, carved out both and identities that proved more complicated and capable than the oft-attributed victim identities of double consciousness. For example, Kopwe could assert the reality of Anishinaabe nationhood while also describing in depth how much he loved seeing Jenny Lind sing in London. That's one of his stopping points and one of the things he spends time describing. Black Elk could receive a vision while performing in Wild West shows in Europe that would then be fundamental to leading his community when he got home. Likewise, the political ideologies of the so-called modernists and traditionalists were diversely distinct and created tension across Indigenous communities at the turn of the 20th century. But Descahe, as a hereditary chief and transatlantic public lecturer, with a mastery of the languages and the political processes of both Haudenosaunee and European modernities, he could do all of that. That sounds very different than double consciousness. Although Descahe and his delegation received support from delegates of such countries as Ireland, Estonia, Panama, and Persia, England and Canada, so some of the same countries who didn't want to include Kopwe's speech in their notes or the minutes of the meeting, those in power ultimately refused to allow him to formally present his petition to the League of Nations. By the time he returned home in 1924, Canada had sidestepped the hereditary political body of the Haudenosaunee and had unilaterally appointed a tribal council and removed him and the other tribal council from any position of power. And he actually died shortly after his return home. Yet his original speech that he presented and distributed throughout Geneva and neighboring cities on behalf of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy carries a distinct Haudenosaunee claim to the continuation of land and nation-based Indigenous sovereignty into modernity. And a number of you raised some interesting questions about what is sovereignty. Like, how do you claim sovereignty? How do you get sovereignty recognized? Does it even exist? And this is an interesting example of 1920s being a delegate from a sovereign nation going and petitioning a body of sovereign delegates from sovereign nations to try to seek recognition on the international or global stage. So when you turn to his actual petition, or their petition, I should say, it begins by seeking membership into the League and with a clear declaration of self-governance as what he describes as the oldest League of Nations, the League of the Iroquois. Descahe then goes on to outline the history of agreements between the Six Nations, or the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the British that are rooted in a recognized homeland. He then lists treaties between the Six Nations and the Dutch and the French, and then more with the British, in support and in verification of their status and position as an independent state. The petition concludes with 6 rights that the Six Nations sought to secure, the first of which is the recognition of their independent right of home rule. By outlining the active settler colonial encroachments on Haudenosaunee territories and sovereign rights, Descahe unravels what scholars today have described as the larger concept of Western modernity, namely a set of self-serving and fictional narratives that hide and disguise coloniality, such that the end of modernity would imply the end of coloniality. He presents, I think, what is probably the most unsettling truth of modernity to his European audience, which is that Indigenous nations continue to exist against the increased strategies and enforcement of settler modernity. Although Descahe was not allowed to be heard in any official capacity by the League of Nations, his reception among at least the German-speaking press of those places he ended up going to visit speaks to a heightened awareness of the illegitimate claims of settler colonial power and a desired affiliation with Indigenous forms of self-governance. So in fact, at least 18 different German language newspapers carried stories of his visit. They largely moved away from this sensational hübsche Bursche type of rhetoric, the sensational romanticization of Indigenous identities, and instead moved toward a recognition of the validity of the political claims of self-governance that he's making. So just as a quick example, I don't have it up here, sorry. This one comes in 1923 from the Allgemeine Tiroler Anzeiger. It said nothing of his appearance. Instead, the paper simply states that he would appear in Geneva, die Anerkennung ihrer Unabhängigkeit zu verlangen, or to demand the recognition of their independence. Other newspapers, such as Der Bund in Bern, translated key portions of the speech, emphasizing again his call for the international recognition of Indigenous sovereignty without any reference to these Wild West romanticized ideas of indigeneity. In addition to repeating his call for recognition of Haudenosaunee sovereignty, these same presses started to point out the unlawful encroachments on Indigenous North American lands. The Swiss newspapers latched on to one point of Haudenosaunee self-governance that they were very excited about, which is the long-standing matrilineal governing structure through which women, rather than men, exercise the right to vote. These papers seem to have been shifting from a fascination with imagined Indigenous identities toward a recognition of the inherent progressive politics of long-standing Indigenous forms of self-governance. So rather than focusing on Descahe's appearance and using terms such as Häuptling or chief, for example, the Grazer Tagblatt recognized the Six Nations as a sovereign state and recognized Descahe as the Bundespräsident, or the federal president, of a nation that had been protecting the rights and responsibilities of women, such as the right to vote, since at least 1,000 years prior to such rights ever existed in the United States or in other modern Western nations. So we'll jump to a conclusion here. In 1850, Capway traveled to the Third World Peace Congress in Frankfurt, preaching the reality and the necessary continuance of land-based sovereignty, of an adaptive form of Anishinaabe nationhood. that he argued could engage in the modern global marketplace of ideas in order to prevent further encroachments upon indigenous lands, epistemologies, and relations. In 1886, Black Elk, or Hehaka Sapa, enchanted Europe with his Wild West performances, but returned to Pine Ridge disenchanted by the individualistic and exploitative ways of the Wasichus, or the whites, as European modernity conflated his identity into a romanticized icon of native nobility that they could claim as becoming European, or at least wanting to become European. Although these conflations and claimings almost killed him, he fell ill when he received his vision. He received a visionary path forward that he would use to guide the Oglala Lakota through the risks and rights of modernity for many years to come. In 1923, Descahe, the Haudenosaunee hereditary chief, arrived in Geneva as a delegate of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy to address the League of Nations about the rights and legal legitimacy of indigenous land-based sovereignty, of modern indigenous nationhood. While the League refused to hear him, he encountered a Swiss public prepared through decades of transatlantic indigenous travel to engage his ideas and amplify his call for international recognition of indigenous nationhood. In each case, transatlantic indigenous travelers at the turn of the 20th century refused to become victims to the internal and external forces of settler modernity that sought to enforce these either-or identities. They found throughout the German-speaking public a fertile foreign soil in which they could plant plans and collaborative possibilities of modern indigenous continuity and futurity on both sides of the Atlantic. Thus, they engaged modernity not as modernist primitives, romantically vanishing Indians, or tragic victims of civilization and progress, but as central contributors to and co-creators of some of the most important political currents, aesthetic movements, and intellectual conversations of the time. Cockway, Black Elk, and Descahe are but three of the hundreds of transatlantic indigenous travelers at the turn of the 20th century. And I feel bad only giving you 3 samples, but we have limited time. There are but 3 of those who remained emotionally, spiritually, and physically rooted to their homelands, their languages, and their community relations, while presenting, performing, and even demanding recognition of indigenous sovereignty abroad. And with this, I just put my own kind of concluding claim. Perhaps this rootedness to land-based epistemologies and practices of self-governance, despite the onslaught of attempts to forever assimilate and thereby eradicate indigeneity altogether, is the unifying aesthetic and embodiment of indigenous modernism, or modernity after all. Thank you.